Brett, I know that you're obviously from South Africa. I was wondering what brought you to the UK. What was the degree that you took in South Africa? I know you eventually landed up at Cambridge in the UK, but
I was studying anthropology and history. History tends to sort of look at sort of broad sweeps of human society, whereas anthropology kind of like zooms in. So that was always kind of an interesting combination. And I guess I kind of have in a lot of my work around finance, I sort of do combinations of these types of things. I try to like get deeply involved in a lot of the parts of the financial world that I find interesting. But yeah, so like I did like anthropology, history and stuff. And then I was involved in various activist movements and sort of alternative culture in South Africa. But then I decided to work in the financial sector as a kind of
certain derivatives.
Yeah, it was like an adventure. It was a really interesting adventure into a part of the world that I had always found very alien. And it was a very productive experience in the sense of, if you are a person who's got a critical outlook on the world, and you only hang around other critical people, it's interesting and fun, but you often end up stuck in the same place all the time. But if you do this, if you actually sort of throw yourself into these types of, like the financial sector or these types of things, which are like challenge you quite a lot or challenge your beliefs quite a lot, it's actually quite useful. Yeah. So I ended up being like kind of like an activist in the financial sector, and I learned a lot of stuff. And I don't know. Should I tell you my whole story? I don't know if you want to hear my story.
Well, a little bit more, maybe. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, basically, I got this combination of sort of knowledge of sort of activism and sort of like critical thinking on the world with knowledge of finance as well. So, like technical parts of finance. Which proved to be like quite useful because I would help activist groups when they were running campaigns on finance and sort of thinking about how would you reform the financial system, and started working on alternative finance projects like alternative currencies and alternative banking structures and stuff. So, sort of combining the sort of technical knowledge of finance with more of the sort of political impulse of, people who are trying to sort of change systems.
I mean, in a sense, you were acting as sort of a bridge, really, weren't you, for helping activists to understand, the workings and goings on of the banking system as well, because there was that kind of naivety quite often attached to.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. I mean, I still to this day do this intermediary role between lots of different groups, and it's not only between activists and the mainstream financial sector, it's also between say technologists and finance, or like different sort of subsets of alternative finance. Actually, you often find in the world there's like all these silos, all these people who work in these specialist silos who never actually speak to each other, who don't really want to speak to each other or have no real incentive often, but you really need people in the world who actively cross between these things. Back in the 1600s, perhaps, if everybody was like fairly integrated as a society, maybe it didn't matter too much because everybody would kind of know what everybody was doing anyway, right? Yeah. But in a huge, like, large-scale, massive global economy, you find loads of specialization. Yeah. But you find very little integration between these groups. So we are the most dependent on each other that we've ever been, but also the most sort of isolated from each other. So I try to like often jump between these groups and sort of negotiate between them or see what's happening between them, and help them out and help them understand each other, as it were.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm afraid we can't avoid you giving like yet another definition of what blockchain is and Bitcoin. Would you mind taking another go at that?
Definition of blockchain and Bitcoin.
Yeah.
I mean, like, I guess at a high level, I would tend to start by saying something like blockchain technology is a means to enable a network of strangers, a big group of people who don't know each other, scattered around the world, a network of strangers to be able to interact with each other without using an overt central party. Historically, that's quite unusual. It's quite difficult for a large, disparate group of people who do not know each other to enter into relationships with each other from across the world without having some central party that sort of mediates the process.
Yes.
So people are most, from a kind of political perspective, the kind of like interesting blockchain was like, this is probably the first time we've had some kind of protocol or system to enable large-scale interaction between strangers without these central parties. In the case of Bitcoin, the nature of the interaction that's occurring is the recording of the issuance and transfer of tokens between people. So monetary tokens between them. So that's what the decentralized system is doing. It's saying you have those tokens and you have those tokens, and no, you've just moved those tokens to somebody else. So it's doing that. Yeah. But hypothetically, you could use the same underlying concept of coordinating a network of strangers to do other things. So a lot of the sort of experimentation around blockchain right now is sort of thinking about how you would adapt it for other sort of purposes. But in reality, the main purpose of blockchain technology to date has been the issuance of tokens and the moving around of those tokens between people without an overt central party being present. And I say without like an overt central party because you're still, it's not really like peer-to-peer. It's not like me directly handing you something. Yeah. All right. It is going through a system. It's just that the system is not like overtly controlled by any one person. All right. So it's like you're going through, instead of like a sort of centralized intermediary, you're going through a decentralized intermediary, but you're still going through an intermediary.
But there's trust now, isn't there? That has been introduced, I suppose.
In the crypto system.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, like the way these guys often describe crypto systems is as trustless systems, which is basically a way of saying, I don't have to. Well, let's just reverse a bit. Yeah. Like if you step out onto the street in London or New York, or wherever you are, all right, like you're gonna find yourself surrounded by people you do not know. All right. Yeah. But you can still like kind of interact with them somehow. Like you don't like overtly trust them, but you don't like actively distrust them, but you don't really know them, right? But like what we've created sort of like what facilitates this process is a whole bunch of institutions like law institutions, money systems, so on, that actually basically enable people who do not know each other around the world to do this kind of activities. So in the cryptocurrency or like blockchain communities, they tend to refer to those as trusted third parties. Yep. So these third parties that we place our trust in order to be able to interact, like, which is like a sort of a way of framing it. And then they then refer to their own systems as being trustless because you do not require the trusted third party.
Right. I was wondering what that meant actually. It seems sort of
It's kind of like there's ambiguities to what it actually means, but. Yeah. The other thing, if you really want to understand this technology, is you've got to understand the technical challenge of building. If you're an engineer, a software engineer, or like a sort of like web engineer, and your job is design a system that's going to be used by millions of people around the world who you do not know, you kind of like. You might be quite trusting as a person. You might actually believe in humanity, but there's a part of you that's like, there could be one person in this network of a million who's an asshole. Yeah. And I have to assume that there could be this one bad actor. And if I'm designing my system, I have to always make this assumption that potentially every person could be that bad actor. Yeah. So that they say that the idea is like, I want to create a system where I don't have to have that trust. I don't have to worry about this being an issue. Yeah. So like the sort of trustlessness from a web engineering perspective is kind of like this idea that like you will be able to trust the system despite the fact that you don't know everybody who's involved in it. Yeah. So it's ambiguous.
Do you have any kind of favorite examples at the moment that you very kind of creative examples you feel that is working well?
Of what?
Of Bitcoin or of? I mean, I noticed that you mentioned in one interview Sardex, which is operating in Sardinia, and I was wondering, was that a sort of hybrid of using sort of Bitcoin with?
No. So look, bear in mind, but prior to cryptocurrencies, there's a whole history of previous alternative currency systems. Yeah. Bitcoin's actually like, this, it's a lot of people in the cryptocurrency community don't realize that actually there's like this entire history of alternative currencies for hundreds of years before this. So the basic sort of categories you tend to find are like local currencies, which are sort of these like localized versions of like, say, the British pound or the localized, so it's like Ithaca hours in the US or like the Brixton pound. Yeah, there's these various types of local currencies. Yeah. Then you get these what are called mutual credit systems. Mutual credit systems are super interesting. It's like basically a way for people to issue credit to each other. Mm-hmm. And for that credit to actually become a form of transferable money. Now, I could describe mutual credit systems, but like, they are a really profoundly interesting form of alternative money systems. Like the most interesting example right now is probably Sardex in Sardinia, which is like a pretty big mutual credit system. Yeah. But you find the same mutual credit systems in other guises. You get like what's called time banks, which are actually a kind of like a form of a mutual credit system that uses time for currency or time for pricing. Mm-hmm. You also get local exchange trading systems and stuff, but these are all based on this idea that you bring a community together and they issue each other credit. Yeah. So these are all like, previous versions of this, and you get various other types of currencies, but then cryptocurrency is really like quite different to a lot of those. Yes. In particular, cryptocurrency's got a very different theory of money behind it. Yeah. A lot of like, if you look at a mutual credit system, it basically relies on the idea that money is essentially credit. Okay. Mm-hmm. People issue promises, and those promises can become essentially money. Yeah. All right. Yeah. And this is like a core part of like how a lot of, say, anthropologists will understand money. The cryptocurrency community comes very much from like a commodity concept of money, which they basically say, before you have money, you have to produce it somehow. Yep. Like I must go and produce it, and then I bring it into a market. Yeah. So like if you ever listen to all like the imagery around Bitcoin, it's like you got to mine the stuff and you make it, and then you like sort of throw it into a market, and then it becomes the money. It's a very different sort of like style of thinking about money to a lot of the original systems. But what's becoming kind of intriguing right now is the possibility of fusing together elements of cryptocurrency architecture with some of the original alternative currency movements. And I think what's interesting about that is that the original alternative currencies have a much more interesting theory of money. I think it's like a more profound theory of money. But the cryptocurrency architecture is authentically interesting. So like when you put those two things together, you start to get some interesting hybrids emerging.
Is that the way forward? Do you think that's?
I mean, that's what I would be personally interested in. There's various groups who are trying to do something like that. The majority of the cryptocurrency community doesn't really pursue that at all. They sort of fixate upon tokens. Yep. They sort of fixate upon this act of sort of issuing tokens and moving them around. Like it's kind of like a token fetish, right? Like a sort of very obsessed by tokens, which is like kind of strange, right? Like tokens, like for a token to have any kind of like meaning, there has to be some like system that makes a token meaningful. It's like the best way to understand this is just to like think about like train tickets. A train ticket is a token. But it ain't going to do anything unless there's a train system at play that makes the train ticket actually do something, right? Yeah. Like in other words, the train ticket is only a train ticket in the presence of a train system.
Yeah.
Okay. Otherwise, it's just a piece of cardboard.
Yeah.
Now, you can issue tokens. You can issue as many code tokens as you want. And you can find a way to move them around, either centralized or decentralized. It doesn't matter. But unless you're going to have some system that makes the token actually have some active power in the world, well, all you've done is issued tokens. So this is the kind of key next step for cryptocurrency communities to try and understand is these systems won't do anything until you actually actively embed them into real world sort of economies and actually really make the tokens have some kind of meaning in the world beyond sort of some speculative value.
Well, I was wondering whether would that sort of hybrid be in existence with something like when for instance what Ben and Jerry's have been doing recently with their kind of carbon capture. They for every scoop of Ben and Jerry's sold a penny is paid towards the purchase of carbon credit, which is I think is being traded on Stella's blockchain exchange. And,
okay, yeah, I haven't looked deeply at that.
But it's quite a nice idea, that, isn't it? So that every time you go into the Ben & Jerry's and you get your ice cream, you basically are, 1p is going towards a carbon credit, and then you can also volunteer to for an additional penny towards an additional credit as well. That's quite a nice way of people being able to understand this in a way, isn't it?
And I guess the basic idea is if you're ever engineering these systems or trying to design these types of alternative economies, you have to be thinking about the whole circuit of how all the parts work. A lot of the time when people are thinking about these systems, they only think about sort of parts of the circuit. For example, I've seen attempts to do sort of solar energy related cryptocurrency stuff. Mm-hmm. So then the person says okay, if you can prove to us that you generate solar energy, we're going to give you some token. And you say, okay, great. So the token represents that I've generated solar electricity. And then I say, so what can I do with this token? Yeah. And they're like, well, we hope that maybe some businesses will take it from you as a sort of show of appreciation or something. But it's so you've built half the circuit, basically. Yeah. So you haven't really designed the whole system. You're sort of hoping that it's going to engineer itself after a while. Yeah. The strongest systems tend to be those which are actually have a full economic design where it's we've worked at all the components of how it's going to work. No, not that the solar stuff can't work, but there's sometimes a little bit of a naivety around these things. In the case of Ben and Jerry's thing, I haven't really looked at how it works or what the deal is. Think about the original carbon markets. I mean, I used to sort of dabble in this world that they're not by no means effective in what they're claiming to do, but let's assume that they actually have some effect. Yeah. The basic idea, at least in the European markets, was government places a limitation on how much carbon people can have, and then it issues these tokens, which are the credits, saying this is your allocation, and then of tokens, and when you emit a certain amount, you have to hand these tokens back to us, which shows you have to have the amount of credits that represents how much carbon you've emitted. Yeah. And if you don't have that amount of credits, you better go buy them from somebody. Yeah. All right. So they create a circuit there. It's you have these sort of objects or these tokens, and then you better go and you got to bring them back to us at some time to sort of account for your carbon. So it kind of makes sense. And I guess with in the case of Ben and Jerry, I mean, I don't really know. There's probably voluntary carbon markets of various sorts, these offset markets. But I mean, there's plenty of interesting things you can engineer. And then I think one of the problems in the crypto community is people getting excited about the decentralized nature of the technology without really thinking about the sort of deeper design of a system. So it's you can implement anything in a decentralized way, right? Mm-hmm. I can implement a really crap carbon credit scheme in a decentralized way, but it doesn't make it not a crap carbon credit scheme, right? So they're often like fixating on the sort of the decentralized nature and not really making robust things on top of that decentralized system. So actually, it makes much more sense to design a really strong system and then make a decision about like, hey, should we implement it on a blockchain or not? But right now, people are almost like starting from the sort of like blockchain thing and then trying to like find like things to put on it, which is like slightly absurd.
Are you slightly